Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Devon Eriksen, who is a middle-aged Gen Xer who don't take no shit from no one, though who is quite capable of dishing it out. He is also the author of Thief of Fire, which is the first in a trilogy of science fiction fantasy novels that he's working on, and those have gotten good reviews from the readership of that. But in this conversation, we mostly focus on his political takes, which he publishes freely on Twitter, and that are not totally spicy, but not totally tame either. And so we get into his perspective on the state of the country and why we are being ruled by midwits and what there is to be done about that. You can find links to his social media and also to his book in the description below. If you enjoy this content, do like, subscribe, and consider donating via the tip jars below. Without further ado, here is Devon Eriksen. What part of the country are you?
Tennessee.
Oh, wow. Is that your native land or late onset Tennessean?
No, we kind of moved here when jobs went remote and I retired and I started writing. So
okay.
We could decide where we wanted to live.
Yeah. What industry were you in before you decided to?
I was an engineer.
Oh, okay. That covers a lot of ground, doesn't it? I was an engineer. You could be doing a lot of different things with that.
Yeah.
Like picture frames or car
parts.
I
wore a lot of different hats, mostly software and electronics related.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. Did you enjoy that career, or was it kind of a ups and downs?
It was fun. Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. You get to build stuff.
Yeah, right. Are we using any of the stuff that you've had your fingers on right now? Any of this infrastructure that we're ignorant of?
If you're using most of the stuff that I built, it comes with like a little complaints card attached. So what you do is you call the number and you stay at your current GPS coordinates, and a complaints team will be with you shortly.
Okay.
Usually we don't really get any feedback from clients. It's very strange. They seem to. I was mostly
I'm reading between the lines here.
Stuff.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, I'm like, this sounds like a missile.
Yes. A little bit of financial industry. I worked for Oculus for a while. Did some AI stuff as well. So kind of wore a lot of hats.
Yeah. Do you have strong opinions one way or another on the current state or direction of this artificial intelligence stuff?
Well, I think people's first response to any kind of advancement in artificial intelligence is, oh goodness, an artificial life form that is equivalent in capability and sentience to a human being is just around the corner. And that's sort of an artifact of the way that we use the word intelligence, because intelligence as a word really sort of means, I don't know how you did that. And so what happens is, what the field of artificial intelligence actually is to people who do it, who work with AI, is, intelligence really just means doing things heuristically, doing things by search, doing things with methods that kind of emulate things that we learned by looking at the human brain and human behavior. So it's this way of solving problems. It doesn't mean that the thing is actually intelligent in the way that we would consider a human intelligent. Yeah. So every time we unlock some way for a piece of software to do some task, however poorly, that a human can do, lay people always think, oh, we're about to create a human. Well, no, we imitated one capacity of a human in some way. We didn't imitate the central function of a human, which is to learn from its environment, make executive decisions, and navigate that environment, in an
Yeah.
autonomous way. And we will eventually get there, but it's not going to be tomorrow, and it's not going to be next year, and it's probably not going to be in 10 or 20 years.
Really? You don't think
Yeah.
it's just going to keep on ramping up faster and faster as it
No,
learns from
no,
itself or whatever?
no, because we're not even on the path yet. We're not putting the Legos together. We're just making Lego blocks, and that's useful, but
Hmm.
it's not, a human being is not around the corner. So this large language model that has everybody so impressed, and it is impressive if you understand what it is. But what it is a very large neural net, which takes a query and tries to generate some sort of answer, and its target is just sounding like human generated text.
Yeah.
There's no thought behind it. It lies to you all the time, and it lies to you all the time because it doesn't have a notion of truth. It doesn't understand the concept of truth. It doesn't understand the difference between truth and a lie. Its
Yeah.
target is sounding like the humans in these writing samples.
Okay.
Basically what it does is it generates tokens in text, and it predicts the next token. And if it ends up sounding an awful lot about like some human beings, then what that actually means is that some human beings weren't as sophisticated as we thought.
Yeah. That's the
We look
thing.
for
Yeah.
artificial intelligence, and what we're actually discovering is how much natural stupidity there is in the world.
Yeah. That's no, I did.
Now,
You see that. Yeah. A
this
lot.
is this is great for assisting a human being in doing things, but if you can be replaced by an AI, you probably deserve to be replaced by an AI.
Or, certain tasks that are incredibly, soul crushing, let's say, like maybe certain documentation
Oh yeah,
tasks
yeah,
with regards
yeah.
to medical things,
Sometimes you
some
deserve to be
things.
replaced by an AI
Yeah.
means you don't deserve to have to do this.
Yeah. 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 No. Yeah.
We're going to take this soul-crushing, mind-numbing, repetitive task off your hands.
Yeah. Yeah. How is the switching? This is a big gear switch, but I think it does
Uh,
jump because we're talking about language models, stuff like that. How is it going from engineering, all these various capacities, to fiction writing, narrative, story,
yeah.
and then also, have you always been opinionated, or is this a newfound
Oh,
talent?
I've always been like this.
Okay, all right, because
Yeah,
you're very opinionated on Twitter, and that's
yeah, yeah.
what I find interesting about what you're doing. But what was the
Yeah, all
change
my
in
life
your
I've
headspace?
had this sort of conversational style where I have this idea and I want to talk people's ear off about it.
Yeah. Okay.
And, lately I've sort of found the audience that kind of likes to hear that. So that's fun.
Hmm.
Um, but going from software engineering to writing fiction was in some ways not a huge leap. And I'll explain that. No one can tell you how to write. They can only tell you how they write. Because what you're doing when you're writing is you're taking a vision, an idea, something out of your head, and you're putting it on paper so it can go in other people's heads. You're translating it into text. So there are as many different processes for writing as there are heads that the ideas come out of. Everybody has their own individual process. And my process looks a lot like software engineering. All of my novel manuscripts are stored in source control. I have, design documents. I have function contracts for all my scenes. I do
Hmm.
bug tracking for corrections. I'm even doing some branching and merging in source control to test various ideas. I have unit tests. It's all very software engineering adjacent.
Hmm.
And if you think about it, pieces of source code are just collaborative text writing projects. Now, the text is in a formal language, and this time it's a story, but there's a lot of overlap.
Hmm.
So my design process is very conscious, very architected. So
When
it
did you
lends
get
itself
into
well to that.
software?
What's that?
Like, when did you start getting into software? When was your
Oh, I was a software engineer for about 20 years.
so what, 90s or
2000.
2000? Okay,
Yeah.
because I've always kind of been fascinated by the concept of a software language and how that developed and what that is. Because you have like you threw a bunch of software words at me that
Hmm.
I don't know what you're talking about. But I knew I have basic understanding that there's this machine that has this ones and zeros, and then
Yeah.
you have stacks of things that are translating this human language into this
Yeah.
machine language and assembly codes
Yeah.
and stuff like that. And it's
Yeah.
just interesting that we've created this artificial language that does something. And is it proper to even call it a language, or what does that mean? And
Sure.
what does that tell us about what we
Sure.
use to think, like our
Sure.
language, English right now, or
Well,
steroids?
a language is just a way of writing down ideas. And you can come up with all different language. You can come up with an infinite number of different languages, and you can tailor them to what you're trying to do. So a computer language is really a language that's designed so that what you say has only one precise meaning. It's never ambiguous. It only has present tense, and it
Hmm.
only has the imperative mood. It's for writing very, very precise instructions.
Hmm.
So, people call this like a formal language as opposed to an informal language like English, which really has more to do with how they came about. But, English started out as a trade language. So it was there to enable people to communicate basic ideas. And that's why English has the largest vocabulary of any natural language because it was able to borrow words from many different languages. That's also why the grammar and spelling is so confusing.
Yeah.
But then you have these formal languages like C++, where they're not for communicating with other people.
Hmm.
Therefore, translating an abstract and ambiguous idea. You take an abstract and ambiguous idea of what you want the computer to do, which is like a design document, and then you translate it into this formal list of instructions.
Hmm. Yeah. With regard to, I guess, computer code, you're making programs or you're
Yeah.
having things regulated in some way, either with the user, something that is for me to use, like this program right here, or something to tell my house to function in a certain way, or
Yeah.
doing something like that. With regard to stories as software, or even philosophies and ideologies as software.
Yeah.
You in the political discourse, we use a lot of metaphors over and over and over again, like this thing's a cult or that thing's a cult, or like the bunch of NPCs, and you can hear that it's
Mhm.
like people are just
Yes.
repeating the same code
Yeah.
language that tells them how to operate and operate in a group in order to accomplish some sort of ends. And then you're like, well, who's
Yeah.
designing this? And you can take it apart. But what is the purpose for you of writing, let's just say Theft of Fire or your book? Like, what are you trying to happen in the other person's head? And how has that involved other parts of you rather than the engineering? Love,
Well,
romance, fun, violence,
mhm.
anger,
Yeah.
emotion, color.
Yeah. Well, I'd kind of like people to read it and enjoy it and pay me a lot of money
Enjoyment.
for the next one.
Okay. Yeah.
That's the most basic approach. But really, what's interesting about stories is not what you consciously set out to do when you write them. Because when you set out to write a story, English teachers have it backwards. You don't start out with a lot of symbolism and metaphor and some allegory you want to tell where your pet dog dying is an allegory for Christ or anything like that. What you don't start with that. If you start with that, you get really, really, really tedious stuff that literary critics praise and about 12 people read. What you really start out consciously to do when you're writing a story is to entertain and hopefully to be paid some money for entertaining because we all have bills. The interesting part about stories, though, is that all of the philosophy and the themes and the outlooks on life and all this sort of richness that people get out of what they call literature, it's it's not what you set out to do, it's what happens to you along the way. You start writing this very simple story, and then as you go through, you start to notice the things that are coming out of your subconscious. Oh, okay. So here I accidentally started talking about personhood because there's this AI character and, she doesn't like being regarded as a piece of property. Or then I started talking about, oh, I guess these two characters are having this conflict. And, now I guess I'm talking about relationships between men and women. And it all just sort of happens. Your authorial style, your authorial voice is really the easiest thing to develop because it consists of the things that you can't avoid doing. It's it's the pieces of yourself that come out onto the page as you tell the story. And so, in a way, a story has many purposes. On one level, it's like, okay, I'm going to tell people a story, I'm going to entertain them, and they're going to pay me. On another level, it's I'm a creative person and I feel the need for self-expression. So I write something down and I want people to see it.
Mm-hmm.
And on another level, it spreads your values. It's a piece of cultural DNA or a piece of cultural software because cultures define themselves by stories. That's why if your culture doesn't really include a notion of art and especially a notion of storytelling, it's a dead culture because it won't pass itself on to the next generation. Your children will grow up reading stories written by someone with different values, and your culture will vanish.
Yeah.
So it's all of these things.
There was a thread that you published, I think it was today. I read it just before we got on. And you kind of take a hard line, or at least a challenging stance towards the notion of conservatism or conservatives.
Yeah.
And you make some critiques about, how it's a kind of not sexy enough, basically.
Well, it doesn't do anything. It just sits there like a lump. And yeah, I'm a big meanie for saying it, but
no, that's fine.
I am a big meanie, so I have to run with that. But
I like to make fun of my
that,
tribe, the centrists, the people who are politically homeless, and whenever I make fun of them, they're like, "Don't! How dare you?" They get really tribal about not having a tribe.
It's that conservatism is this word whereby a tribe of people define themselves as having no vision and they just want to preserve the status quo. Like there's this pile of stuff that constitutes civilization and we're just going to guard the stuff and we want everything to stay the same. Well, that's not how the world works. The world is constantly in flux. Society is constantly changing. And it changes because technology progresses. And all of a
Hmm.
sudden, things are different than they were yesterday.
Are they?
So,
You think they're
yeah.
fundamentally different?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Take your standard Bronze Age sheep herder and drop him in the middle of Los Angeles and see how much is recognizable to him.
Hmm.
It's we can all say, well, human nature stays the same, sure, but human nature is responsive to its environment, and we radically change our environment every 100 years, and it's starting to be every 50, every 20, every 10.
Hmm.
And we have to have some notion of changing our social mores, the way that we do society to keep up with that.
Like in what
And
way? Like sexual mores, relational
well,
mores? Like what
sexual
core?
mores, how we relate to each other, what the rules are, what we do with our technology. For example, when we talk about AI art, you know, what I've noticed is that people talking about what our attitude and policy towards AI art should be is we have this shouting match between two analogies. You have some people over here who think that an art AI like DALL-E is a massive database of images taken in violation of copyright, and you just sort of shove them in a blender
Yeah.
and you hit puree for a bit,
Yeah.
and out comes something else, and you are stealing bread from the mouths of artists.
Hmm.
And then there's other people who conceptualize this art AI as a human being, and it looks at pieces of art and it learns how to make art in the same way that humans learn how to make art. And so it isn't stealing if human beings aren't stealing by taking an art class.
Well, I mean, yeah, no more steal,
And
no more
yeah,
thievery, theftish than
yes,
Picasso, I
yeah,
guess, right?
yeah. And so what this is two outdated metaphors and sets of social mores, which people are trying to apply to a new thing. We won't know what to do with AI art. We won't know how to make customs and social expectations and laws about it until we understand it as a thing with its own nature. And so this is what technology does to us.
Hmm.
AI art changes the landscape. The internet changes the landscape. Radio and television changed the landscape. The automobile changed the landscape. And social customs had to adapt. Well, when you label your political movement conservative, where you only want to preserve, you only want to resist change, then you have no way of saying not only this is how we adapt, this is how we're going to change to adapt to this. You also have no way of saying this is our vision for how tomorrow will be better than today.
Hmm.
You have essentially no vision. And that sounds almost like stereotypical to say, "Oh, you
Well,
have no vision." It's like people say that so often that it's
yeah.
almost bereft of meaning.
Well, you're
But
using the term vision in terms of like a time-bound future vision, a vision of like
an
historical
a
vision rather
goal,
than a.
a goal and a concept of what we want, of the change we want to see in the world.
Hmm.
Because everyone, even the people who call themselves conservatives, actually want to see change in the world. But by labeling themselves as conservatives, they shackle themselves to a brand and a metaphor that does not embrace the idea of having a vision.
Well,
And
what
so
would
it
be
becomes very difficult for them to construct a coherent narrative for what they are going to do for society.
What would be an alternative branding that would still utilize the values that conservatives are seeking to implement into the world?
Well, it really depends on how they construe those values, because right now, the political right wing doesn't really have unified values. It's sort of the Stop Socialism coalition,
Mm-hmm.
and it consists of everything from libertarians who have gotten into the right wing tent because the left has gone crazy, all the way to very, very religious people who would love to establish a theocracy. And there's no real shared values there. There's just a shared enemy. So I think that it's very difficult to take this big tent label conservative and try to rebrand it as a whole thing. But there are certain ideas within it that can definitely be rebranded.
Mm-hmm.
You can rebrand certain ideas under religion. You can rebrand ideas as individualist. You can rebrand ideas as libertarian. You can rebrand ideas as technocratic. You can start talking about how, okay, the way to benefit, you can start having this discussion, is the way to benefit society's least fortunate or least adapted really to sort of move money around, transfer wealth with the force of government? Or is it to create a more technological and wealthy society where there are more ways for people to thrive? That's a very different conversation than we want things to stay the same, and then the other party becomes we want things to change without
Mm-hmm.
any discussion of what direction that change should be.
Yeah.
My point
Could,
is that
yeah.
there is no avoiding change. The political question, the social question is, what do you want the change to be?
Okay. In your writing, both, well, I don't know to what extent your fiction is moral
Hmm.
or amoral or immoral or whatever, like, but it's got to have values because you already
Well, it's
said, you
not
already admitted, like,
preachy.
it's good. It's
It's
good.
it's
Oh, yeah.
not preachy. I preach
Yeah.
in my nonfiction writing,
Yeah.
but I loathe and despise um, authors of fiction who lecture people. And that includes the ones I agree with, like Ayn Rand,
Yeah.
because it's fundamentally intellectually dishonest to try to win a political argument with a fictional character that is essentially a sock puppet on your left hand and you're making their mouth move. And
Mm-hmm.
moreover, it creates a boring story because readers aren't dumb, readers are smart. They know when you're trying to influence them. So in fiction, I always try to say, I'm not going to tell you what to think. I'm going to tell you, here's some things to think about.
Mm-hmm.
And then you decide what you think.
And in your nonfiction writing,
Mhm.
what do you end up conveying? Is there a place that you are from or for
Mhm.
yourself?
Mhm. I would, if I had to pick a term, I would probably choose the terms libertarian or anarcho-capitalist. I believe that we 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 would like to create a society that maximizes individual control over one's own destiny.
Hmm.
And government tends to get in the way of that. So we would like to explore ways to eliminate that.
Hmm.
The goal being that eventually you try to create a society where as many human interactions as possible occur by mutual consent rather than some other, rather than through coercion.
Hmm. Uh,
And that's sort of a
yeah,
long-term goal
coercion.
rather than, oh, we need to eliminate government tomorrow. Well, government is used to do things, and even if it's not the only way to do things, it's the thing that we've been doing. So we have to find the technology to privatize these things. And that's a gradual process. But the end goal is to have a society without a government.
Yeah. What is your stance on feminism? And it is, this does have to do with what you were just saying, but I'm
Mhm.
just curious.
Well, it strikes me not so much as an ideology, but more as a form of sort of social or rhetorical strategy. Because if you watch it over the years, it doesn't really have any coherent philosophy in common. And, I'm sure that feminists would argue with that and say, the common proposition is that women are equal human beings. Well, that has never been not true in the West since the since the rule of the Catholic Church was overturned. But
Hmm.
what it strikes me is that it is the lumping together of a series of rhetorical techniques that some groups of women use to try to gain more political power.
Okay. So it's a political project.
It's a political project.
Okay.
And
And
it's not always used by the same people. Sometimes the people using the same rhetoric or drawing on the same concepts are very different people with very
mhm,
different goals.
mhm. You put
So
yourself
it's
in the crosshairs of the online gender debate when you proposed, and I think you did quite well in doing this,
yeah.
that feminism is gave birth to that thing called gender ideology,
Oh yeah.
or and the trans
Hmm.
ideology is now eating its mother,
Oh yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used the story of the golem of Prague, and
Hmm.
the world is full of golems that have turned on their creators.
Hmm.
And, the feminism giving rise to the transgender ideology, whereby men in dresses are doing to women what feminists did to men 50 years before. That's one example, but
Hmm.
the world is full of examples of groups that created that had a political goal, and they created a monster in order to achieve that political goal, and they were unable to anticipate what this monster would do, and it eventually turned against them. So this idea that gender is a construct was was essentially sort of a monster that was created by feminism, and it has now turned upon women and is attacking them.
Hmm. Do you, is this, what does this say about your opinion on political projects in toto? Should people
Hmm.
just not have political projects because they tend to just eat them alive? And
Well, the
is your
theme
political project
is,
to decrease
yeah.
politics so that these things don't happen over and over again?
Well, if there is a moral here, it's be careful with that axe, Eugene. Um, the world abounds in these sort of midwits who can who are very passionate about the first order consequences of what they propose to do,
Mm.
but they don't always have the intellectual capacity to to imagine the second order consequences, the consequences of the consequences, and the third order consequences, the consequences of the consequences of the consequences, and so on
Yeah.
to infinity.
Yeah.
And what you tend to find is that there's a certain, and I don't want to ascribe exact IQ numbers to these, but, people whose intellectual capacity is modest, they tend not to have political projects. They're like, I want to save up some money and buy a house and get married and have some kids. And I want the city I live in to be nice. And, I like a new car. So they tend not to come up with these grand political plans. But then, sort of above those people in intellectual capacity, you have a bunch of people who they were born smart, they grew up smart, they were educated mostly in public school, where the teacher gave them worksheets. And on the worksheet, what you had to do was you read it, there's a problem, it's got a solution. You can get the solution by applying your intelligence to it, and you have a clever idea, and then everybody goes, yay, you get an A.
Hmm.
And these people are dangerous. These people are dangerous because when they grow up, they think the world's like that. They think, I am smart. If I apply my intellect to the world, it's just like those worksheets. I'm going to come up with something clever and everybody's going to clap.
Hmm.
And this is how you get things like Marxism and feminism, which is really sort of Marxism applied to sex roles.
Hmm.
Um, and then, sort of above that sort of intellectual grade of people who think like this, you have sort of rarer individuals. They're not completely unknown, but they're a minority of people who look at the world and go, holy shit, that is complicated. Okay, I know I'm smart. I know I solved all the worksheets, but anything I do in the world has ripple effects that go out to infinity. And so I'm going to be very cautious, and I'm not going to try to logic this all out in my head. If I have a plan that seems like a good plan to me, I'm going to start with a small experiment and see if I can figure out what the real consequences will be.
Hmm.
It's once you get above this sort of mid-wit grade, you start having people who will argue passionately for their ideas, but when they want to implement them, they'll have some intellectual humility
Mm,
of,
caution.
yeah, this could
Yeah.
blow up in my face.
Yeah.
And this attitude of, hey, this could blow up in my face. Let's be cautious. Let's be empirical instead of being Aristotle, sort of sitting on his chair and thinking with pure reason about the universe and deciding that heavier objects must fall faster. Let's do experiments and look at the
Mm.
results instead.
Okay. Yeah.
That kind of attitude is something that usually it takes really smart people to sort of acquire that on their own, but then it's a piece of culture. They can teach that to other people if
Hmm.
they'll listen. So my attitude about politics is that I want to spread this idea of, hey, the universe is complicated. The economy is complicated. Civilization is complicated. You don't just get to say, let's have a 100% inheritance tax so that we can redistribute every generation's wealth and everybody can have an equal start when they come of age. This sort of grand plan that sounds like a good idea if you think about it for 15 seconds. And then you think about it more and you realize, oh, wait, I've just forced the sale of every family farm and every family business, and I've destroyed all this intergenerational knowledge of how to do something. And I've made every generation's wealth flow through the government, and this will be a disaster. So I'm trying to, what I try to do is sort of puncture these super bad political ideas
Yeah.
instead of saying, hey, we should try this instead. We should try that instead. I try to puncture the bad ideas. And so that maybe people can absorb not only the lesson, but the meta lesson, which is be careful with your ideas,
Yeah.
be careful with your philosophy.
Well, with that said, you put up this political project of some sort of ANCAP or a libertarianism
Yeah.
to make a world where there's more and more interactions between human beings are based on consent and less are based on coercion. What is the second, third, fourth order consequences of a consent-based society?
Well,
And
that's not
is
a
that not what
plan.
we're looking at now?
Yeah. That's
Is
that's
just
not
consent run amok?
that's not a plan, that's a goal.
Okay.
And so, I fully acknowledge when we talk about this that there are many problems that will have to be solved before we can get there. And you don't necessarily have every idea about how you're going to get there. So one of the problems that you face is that there's a small percentage of human beings with a very large footprint who, when you let them do what they want to do is make trouble for other people.
Yeah.
There's a certain, maybe 1% or less of, most groups of people, higher in some, lower in others, that, they're the reason why we can't have nice things. And if you look at police records of people, you'll see that it's the same people over and over and over again. So one of the technologies that you have to develop is a way for coping with these people. And maybe it becomes, okay, we're going to exile those people from our society. And then the people within our society can be free because we're restricting ourselves to the people that can actually handle freedom.
Yeah.
Or maybe you have different ways to do that. One thing that I've observed is that you really have two choices if you want a functional society. You can either throw a small amount of people in prison, or you can refuse to do that and then run your whole society like a prison.
Mm.
So I fully acknowledge that when I articulate this goal, I don't know how to reach it. I don't know every detail of how I would want to reach it. And it's going to require a lot of plans. And those plans are going to have to be made very cautiously and require a lot of testing.
Yeah.
And one of the nice things about free societies and about capitalism is that you have a lot of different people with a lot of different ideas, and they all get to try their ideas. And then we get to see whose ideas are thriving and whose ideas create Detroit. And then we imitate the people who are
Detroit
thriving.
during which decade would be the other question.
Detroit during the modern era.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm obviously not talking about when they were the center of the auto industry.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to what you're saying about change and fluctuation and adaptation. I'm wondering about consent. What is the limits of consent? What are the limits of this liberal ideology that says man is a rational creature that will, by and large, act in self-interest and for the good of other men?
Yeah.
If given the proper incentives.
You general there are some limits to it. And
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 what are
one of
those
the,
limits? What mitigates those limits? It seems to be virtue, I think, like some sort of like inherent
well,
or like
you could
society
describe
already
it
has
as
these virtues.
virtue. You could describe it as being pro-social. You
Mm.
know,
Hmm.
you could describe it as being able to anticipate the consequences of your own actions. I think that
Hmm.
I think that there is a large intellectual component to pro-social behavior.
Hmm.
You know, it's there are obviously, domestic animals, your dog, your cat. You cannot be meaningfully liberated because there are certain choices they are not capable of making.
Hmm. Hmm.
You can let your cat choose what kind of food he wants to eat, but your cat can't meaningfully participate in the decision of whether you're going to buy or rent a house. It
Hmm.
doesn't understand that. So there are certain people who are better at understanding the consequences of their own actions, and there are people who are worse at that. So I think whenever you have any notion of governance, whether it's a literal government or whether it's how are we setting up our social mores, what you have to think about is the sort of the bottom tier of society, the criminal underclass, the antisocial people, the
Hmm.
people who they act on emotion and they like the sound of glass breaking.
Hmm.
And then you have to also govern with the top tier of society in mind. You know, the guy who says, well, it would be really great if humanity were a multiplanetary species. So I'm going to invest my money in building a reusable rocket booster. Or the guy who says, you know, aging is not all that great. And I don't really think that people should just die after 70, 80, 90 years. I think they could learn some things if they stuck around longer. So
Hmm.
I'm going to spend a lot of money and run a lot of experiments on myself to try to fight aging. These are intensely pro-social activities,
Hmm. Hmm.
and so when we govern with the top and the bottom in mind, we want to figure out how to limit the damage done by antisocial people if we're unwilling to just use the approach that previous societies did and hang them.
Hmm.
um, and then at the same time we want to as much as possible stay out of the way of people who are really really trying to build for everybody.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, you brought
And
up yeah, what?
go
Sorry.
ahead.
No, you just brought up these two guys who are trying to escape the velocity of Earth and death, and it just made me
Yeah.
think about if that's not saying something about your values of
Oh yeah,
innovation, techno
absolutely.
optimism kind of
Absolutely. And
stuff.
I
Yeah.
picked those two people, and anybody will be able to pick out the names precisely because they're two people who are doing work to the benefit of mankind. But there's a lot of people out there who think, oh, these people are big jerks. Well, I don't care.
Hmm. Hmm.
I don't actually care. We've sometimes lost the distinction between the great man and the nice guy.
Hmm. Hmm.
you know, Nice guys are polite to people around them and they're fun to be around. Great men benefit humanity. And you can be either one and not the other.
Really, you
Yeah,
can't be a nice,
absolutely.
great man
Well, you can
or
be
great,
both.
nice.
You can
Yeah.
be both, but you can be either one without being the other. You
Yeah.
can be a
Okay.
great man without being a nice guy, and you can be a nice guy without being
Okay.
a great man.
Yeah. Yeah. What were some of the role models for you growing up? Great men or nice
That's
men?
that's a tough one. I tend I tend not to idolize people. I'm really more interested in ideas.
Okay.
But there have been a lot of people where it's like this person's idea, I like this idea very much.
Hmm. Yeah. And
And I always thought that, I noticed fairly early on that I was a highly disagreeable person.
hmm.
And what
Are you
that
okay
means
with
is,
that, or do you don't even care?
well,
You don't even
what that
care that's
means
how
is not
disagreeable you are.
necessarily he's an asshole. It's more in the sort of the five-factor personality model
Yeah.
sense,
Yeah.
where an agreeable person is someone who tends to speak very loudly when they see something they approve of, and to shut up when they see something they disapprove of. And we absolutely need those. Every new idea needs cheerleaders. Every
Hmm.
vision needs people who can be enthusiastic about it. But a disagreeable person is somebody who tends to speak up a lot when he sees something he disapproves of and tends to just sort of nod and go, yeah, cool. Okay, good. When he sees something he approves of.
So
And
this is the Karen archetype then.
well,
Karen,
perhaps,
let me see your
perhaps,
manager. Okay.
I would say that the stereotype of Karen also includes that they disagree with things for frivolous reasons. So I've come to believe that society needs a certain amount of disagreeable people,
Yeah.
because if we all consist entirely of a bunch of human golden retrievers sitting around in a circle telling each other what a good boy we are, oh yes we are, then you tend to get a lot of bad ideas that
Huh.
hurt people floating
Propagating.
around.
Yeah.
And
Well.
ideas don't get subject to the kind of scrutiny they need to be subject to.
Hmm.
So I was always really into, like, okay, if you're going to say something significant that's really going to help all of us, you're going to upset some of us. And I made my peace with that long ago.
Hmm. Hmm. Is there when did you start your Twitter account and using it in the way that you've been using it to just as a kind of your platform for your nonfiction ideas, let's say?
Last July.
Last July. And
Last July.
how is that, why and how has that been? Like, why did you start it and how has it
Well,
been? How has that shown you what to do?
I I had written a novel that I was very proud of,
Your wife's very proud of
and
it too.
she said so once or twice. and and I, was going to get it out the door fairly soon. Happened in early November. And I was working on the second one. And I had some notion of, gosh, if I want people to read this and enjoy it, then maybe somebody needs to know it exists. And, maybe I should check out this whole social media thing. And I really had no coherent plan. I had
Hmm.
no idea what I was doing. I mean, I knew that you can't just get on Twitter and go, hey, everybody, I wrote a book. And people are going to say, who are you? And who cares? Because, committing to a novel is an act of trust, and you have to
Hmm.
gain people's trust before they
Hmm.
will actually read your stuff. And so, almost without a plan, I just started saying what I thought when I saw the things I saw. And I realized after a while that between these sort of takedowns of bad ideas and, oh, here is how I think this thing works, and here is how I think these things fit together, and here is how I see the world, you know, people started getting a little bit interested in that. And, now I have about 38,000 people following me, and it goes up, a couple of thousand every month or so.
Hmm.
Um, so I just sort of slid into it empirically, the way that I speak on Twitter, and it kind of works because, people get interested in what I have to say in a non-fictional sense, and then they say, "Oh, this guy can write."
Hmm.
And then they buy the book, and then a lot of people have liked that, and
Hmm.
they start hassling me about when's the next one coming. Don't
Yeah.
turn into George Martin on us. And I'm like,
Well, yeah. Wait,
it's
wait
been
4 or 5 books.
five months.
Yeah.
Give
Yeah.
me a
Yeah.
moment.
Have you started to see, or were you already aware of kind of your political leanings or your map or
Oh
like
yeah,
what you're interested in, or
yeah.
like, and how does having that audience bring light to what you're, bring more awareness to what you think from your own
Well,
point of view?
I think that one of the things that we started to see when there was some decensorship of social media,
Hmm.
because the conspiracy theorists were right all along, and most of us owe them a huge apology. The government was calling social media on the daily and telling them not only what but who to silence. And this if this doesn't outrage you, you're not paying attention. The people who founded this country would be stacking bodies and setting fire to buildings around now
Hmm.
because of this. And yeah, but when that started to go away because of the actions of just a few individuals who had the financial power to do this, um, we sort of started realizing that, you know, a lot of people in this country don't really agree with these strong and bizarre political agendas. It's just if you start talking sense from a standpoint of how do we improve the quality of life in our society? How do we make it stable and peaceful and orderly and productive and resistant to these bad ideas? People start to say, yeah, I want that. I don't know precisely how we get there, but I want that. I'm tired of riots and hyperinflation and these sort of nonsensical political propaganda campaigns. So, for a long time we're sort of exiting the era of politeness.
Yeah, I just remarked on that with to my wife this morning because people are getting fed up with these protesters and starting to,
Hmm.
to mock them, call them the
Yeah.
return of the word retard. I think is
Yes.
good because now we can actually
Yes.
name retarded
Yes.
ideas,
We can we
and
can
when
say when things are fake and gay.
yeah, when they're fake and gay and retarded, and when we banned retarded, things got more and more retarded, and now we can
Hmm.
rein it back in.
Hmm.
No offense to
Yeah.
retards,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Yeah. We've started to realize that the optimum amount of impoliteness and the optimum amount of ass kickings and the optimum amount of fascism in
Oh,
society isn't 100%, but it also isn't zero.
okay. What do you mean by fascism? Is it the find out part of the fuck around?
Yeah, it's the find out part. Fascism is hypersensitivity to disgust.
Hmm.
The first thing that Hitler did when he came to power was fumigate all the factories.
Hmm.
Under massive public health campaigns. The
Really?
man was a vegetarian through sheer fastidiousness, and he bathed twice a day, at least. He was hypersensitive to disgust. And so it's obvious that that can go off the rails, which spectacularly it did, you know, but you need some sensitivity to disgust
Hmm.
because there is that which is disgusting, you
Well, it's
know.
interesting because what we're talking about is like this return to a certain amount of rudeness and
Hmm.
also a certain amount of disgust reflex, and how
Yes, yes,
how this
yes,
hyper, like
absolutely.
how the progressive hyper niceness is
Uh-huh.
also very seedy
There
at the same
is
time,
there is that which we cannot tolerate. There is
very
that which
permissive.
we should not tolerate.
Yeah.
And because if you think of a human being, and if you think of any animal, all animals have skin. And the purpose of skin is to keep the stuff that you want in and to keep the stuff that you don't want, the stuff that is poisonous to you, out.
Hmm.
And so obviously you have to take in some things through your skin. You have to eat food. You have to breathe air. You have to accept some external influences from the environment in order to benefit them, but you need a barrier. You need a filter function. You need some sort of boundary that says, this I will take in and I will tolerate, and
Hmm.
we will embrace it because it is good. And this we will not tolerate because it is bad for us. And that's where the rudeness and the ass kickings come in,
Okay.
because there are certain levels of fuck around where we have to make sure that people find out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Otherwise, anything goes, including the default actions of those antisocial people that I talked about earlier who like the sound of glass breaking.
Yeah. What is your take on the toleration of that contingent of humanity in current times since the 2020s or the
Mm-hmm.
2010s? Seems like the antisocial people were enshrined in
Mm-hmm.
very explicit ways. I mean, if you
Yeah,
look at George Floyd's life, he was
yeah,
definitely somebody who did,
yeah,
you can blame society or blame whoever, but
yeah,
he was an antisocial maniac.
yeah. George
But
Floyd
he's
was a
a
net
saint.
negative.
He was a net negative. He was a drug addict. He, robber, and
Yeah,
abuser of women, you know.
yeah, yeah. And you can talk about how,
But
you
why was
know,
he? Why were they lifted up? Why is Antifa lifted up? Why are these disgusting practices of sexual, just licentious, lifted up and enshrined? What's your
well,
take on that?
it's virtue signaling
Yeah, but it's
because,
it's vice signaling. That's my
well,
point.
vice is a virtue that does not exist in balance with other virtues.
Okay.
So the reason that virtue signaling can create vice is that you are signaling one virtue to with the idea that it is the sole good to the exclusion of other virtues.
Like
So
consent or, sexual
like
freedom or
say, for
choice.
example, if we idolize compassion
Yeah.
and consider wisdom to be unimportant, then we
Or
very
discernment.
rapidly reach a point
Okay.
where compassion becomes a vice.
Mhm.
Yeah, any virtue becomes a vice if it is not working in concert with other
And why do you
virtues.
think it was the progressive virtues or the
Hmm.
niceness, politeness,
Uh-huh.
acceptance,
Uh-huh.
inclusion? Why do you
Well,
think those got embraced and enshrined?
well, that's because you have you have the political spectrum in the United States, at least, and to an extent in the West, being drawn as the spectrum between change and no change. The model of conservative that I talked about
Hmm.
earlier. So it doesn't become this vision of society versus that vision of society. It becomes change versus no change. And so everybody who is not happy, who is not comfortable, who is not doing okay, who wants a change in society, they all go to one side of the political spectrum. And so now the people who
Hmm.
want changes that are maybe a little bit more reasonable, maybe, you know, they they want to tolerate certain things that aren't really harmful to society. They're just, not tolerated for historical or customary or religious reasons. They suddenly find themselves as political allies in the same tribe with the people who want to harm others, who want to engage in behavior that harms others, and they want tolerance for that behavior. And so
Hmm.
then all of your people who want sort of rational change, now when these irrational types come along and say, I am a woman, I insist you all treat me as a woman,
Yeah. Don't kink
or,
shame
you
me.
know, I want to
Hmm.
burn down local businesses because I perceive myself as having been economically oppressed. These people now perceive, these two groups perceive each other as allies.
Hmm.
Like, I can't say anything about them burning down Target because I have already declared allegiance to the idea that maybe Black people aren't being treated fairly.
Hmm.
These two ideas get lumped together,
Yeah.
and it's like you can't you get this political polarization where you can't simultaneously sustain the two ideas that maybe historically Black people have been treated unfairly, and maybe there's some underlying thing that we should address when 13% of the population commits 50% of the violent crime. These two ideas are not contradictory,
Hmm.
and yet they get separated on opposite sides of the political spectrum.
Okay.
So you have the one side that is all compassion, all tolerance, all the time, and the other side that is just resistance to anything new when there sometimes needs to be something new.
Hmm. What's the corrective, or what do you perceive the corrective being? And is it
Well,
is it a foot?
people have to get uncomfortable because most people, your average person doesn't respond to threats to abstract ideas like liberty or justice. They they start to get really unhappy and they demand change and then they create change when the bullshit starts to impact their lives. So,
Hmm.
you can have all the rhetoric you want about, you know, decolonization, and you can tear down a whole bunch of statues of great men, and that's not going to get people riled up. But people start getting riled up when their communities get burned down and when the government is printing money and devoting it to these projects and, stealing most of it. And so your savings are suddenly worthless and your grocery bill is twice what it was. So I think what we're starting to see now is that people are essentially tired of the bullshit
Yeah.
because when it was just nonsense, they were willing to keep their heads down. But now it's starting to impact their lives in concrete ways.
Is there a political solution to this? And by political, I mean political as politics operate now? Can we vote this into being this change that needs to happen?
Well, when Congress has an approval rate around 20% and a reelection rate around 90%, the power of the vote has clearly been diminished.
Yeah.
And that's not just through fraud, it's through controlling the limited number of choices that are allowed and through this sort of
Hmm.
inertia and control of the mechanisms of publicity.
Yeah.
So I think we can go back to that saying of there are four boxes to be used in defense of liberty, and these are the soapbox, the ballot box, the jury box, and the ammo box.
Hmm.
And I think people misinterpret every one of these.
Oh.
So the soapbox doesn't mean that you go stand on street corners and harangue people, because we have discussions like this all day and they don't necessarily affect the political process. The soapbox is where you go to your representative and you harangue them. And that's the first stage. And that works when your representatives are still representing you, when they're still beholden to you.
Yeah.
So when they stop doing that, then the ballot box is where you vote them out. And, that works when elections are free and fair and well informed. And I think that's not really the case any longer. So you go to the third box, you go to the jury box. And the jury box, again, has been misinterpreted
Hmm.
because what it really is about is not just refusing to enforce bad laws in a literal jury box. It's also the whole concept of nullification. So ultimately, Washington, D.C. is a swamp. And I don't mean metaphorically. It's a literal swamp that
Oh,
someone
it's
paved
swampy.
over.
Yeah, it's very
It
swampy.
has it has no strategic value. It's just a place where a bunch of people write things down on paper. And that has vast power if we treat ourselves as beholden to the paper. But when the process whereby those papers are created is no longer responsive to us, that third option is to say, we're going to treat this just as if it were a piece of paper. We're going to nullify.
Hmm.
We're going to refuse to enforce this law. And this is being done on the state level and the local level, and it can be done on the individual level. And the way that excuse
Bless you.
me,
Yeah.
this is happening on both the left and the right. The left did it with marijuana and with immigration law, and now the right is doing it with guns.
Hmm.
And so you notice the federal government has been very, very cautious about provoking a confrontation with any state that decides to nullify federal law because they know full well that they're dependent on local enforcement for federal law. And if they go to war with the states, they are going to lose. They know this. So this has successfully legalized marijuana in a great many places, despite the fact that it's still illegal on a federal level. It's when you no longer have influence over the laws, you have to start to ignore them. And then the last stage is the ammo box, is if the federal government actually does decide to go to war with these states over nullification. And so a revolution does not take the form of, a bunch of guys in pickup trucks with big American flags forming a column and driving slowly down the freeway toward Washington, D.C., so that they can all be killed in drone strikes the way a lot of leftists like to fantasize about.
Yeah.
What happened, the way this actually goes down is that states start to nullify federal policy and communities start to nullify federal policy. And then the federal government has to send thugs into your neighborhood to enforce their own laws.
Yeah.
And then they're coming into these neighborhoods where they're outnumbered and outgunned.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the last stage. And it is to be hoped that we don't get there
Yeah.
because
But
we are at stage 3 right now.
okay. What
And
about the
what's that?
sorry, fiat currency? I think
Mhm.
currency is a
Yeah.
big aspect
Yeah.
to this.
Yeah.
But go on.
Certainly.
Finish your
Certainly. Well, cryptocurrency kind of addresses that if we can adopt it. But, stage 3, I want to emphasize, it really does work. If we look at this whole massive power grab that was conducted under the under the auspice of the COVID epidemic. A lot of people have this impression that mask mandates went away at a certain point and people stopped wearing them. It was the other way around. People got sick of it. They stopped hiding in their houses. They stopped wearing masks. And the federal government and the state governments very quickly said, oh, you don't have to do that anymore. Because they wanted to disguise the fact that they were powerless to enforce their own laws.
Yeah.
Laws can only be enforced if the majority of the population thinks it's a good law and agrees with the enforcement of it.
Yeah.
As far back as, file sharing sites, LimeWire, Kazaa, Napster, Pirate Bay, there was a huge top-down push to criminalize all of this. And the RIAA was, suing little girls and grandmas and whatnot.
Yeah.
And this went nowhere because everybody was doing it. So a law can be enforced if a small minority of people dissent.
Yeah.
If everyone dissents and ignores the law, then the law cannot be enforced. So the way to fix the federal government is not to vote for some other shyster, because there's no real difference between the two parties. The way to fix the federal government is to start ignoring their policies and nullifying what they do. And if it gets far enough, at a certain point, some state is going to say, some set of states is going to say, that federal income tax withholding thing, we're not going to make companies in our state do that. We're not going to do that anymore. You're going to have to send them a tax bill in April. And then it's really over.
Could you describe that in detail, like how that would happen and what that would mean?
Well, people would have to be a lot more fed up than they are now. But ultimately, every federal policy is dependent on state resources for enforcement. Not just enforcement in the sense of kicking people's doors in and dragging them off, but enforcement in the sense of locating people who are violating policy and, tracking them down and implementing that policy. So if at a certain point, these these policies, which were like, okay, in the past, you have a 15% income tax or whatever, and, you're trying to pay for World War II. Most people think, yeah, okay, we should chip in, and everybody kind of goes along with this plan.
Hmm.
But then now you're trying to say, okay, there's a 25% tax on unrealized capital gains. And everybody says, wait a minute. And the federal government insists. State governments are going to say, well, we're not going to enforce that. We're not going to arrest people for that, and we're not going to let you come in and do it.
Hmm.
So now the federal government has a problem because it doesn't have enough federal agents to go after everybody.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
then you can either provoke a confrontation, which you're going to lose, or you can change your tune real fast.
Hmm.
So dissent works, but I think at this point, the dissent will have to come from outside the sort of legal, formalized voting system.
Yeah. Okay.
The
What would happen
dissent will
if,
have to be made manifest directly.
do you think that it's possible that, say, Texas and Florida and those states, I think there's a state or two
Mhm.
between those two states.
Yeah.
That's a joke, but I don't know their names off the top of my head
Yeah.
because I'm an American and I'm an idiot. But do you think, like, if they said, there are certain taxes that just don't make any sense, and the money's not going anywhere other than to pay for you printing more money and then sending most of it over to other overseas to these wars that are kind of specious anyways, because where's the money actually going? If Texas, Florida did what you just said,
Mhm.
what
Yeah.
would happen to the population? Do you think people would vote by moving down there, and like people would just hole up down
Vote
there?
with their
And
feet.
yeah,
That could happen. I mean, this whole system, remember what I said about second and third order effects. This whole
yeah,
system at this point becomes chaotic, so it's
yeah,
unpredictable.
yeah. Okay.
You can't predict how these things will go down. I'm only trying to talk about these are the forces that are in play.
Yeah, here's some levers that could be
There is
pulled.
there is really no way to guess how these forces will interact
Hmm.
on a real level. But beyond pointing out that the federal government's greatest strengths are also its greatest weaknesses, and those are twofold. Its greatest strength and weakness is number one, the appearance of legitimacy, and
Yeah.
number two, the appearance of power. The appearance of legitimacy and the appearance of power is what keeps most people obedient.
Hmm.
But those are also the attack surfaces because attacks don't have against it don't have to succeed legally and they don't have to succeed militarily. They only have to remove the appearance of legitimacy and remove the appearance of overwhelming power.
Hmm. Okay.
There's a concept
Hmm.
that Kurt Vonnegut writes about in now that's embarrassing. I've forgotten which book.
Cat's Cradle.
It's called a
Mother Night.
granfalloon,
Okay. Grandfather.
and it's sort of a concept in this kind of joke religion that he has in this book. But it's a granfalloon is a fictitious association between people that only exists because people believe in it. And, he takes the book in a somewhat different direction. But interestingly enough, there are a lot of organizations in reality, very, very powerful entities like the United States of America, that only exist because people believe they do.
Hmm.
And so if the current sort of looting the public treasury by the political class continues. And the setting of policy entirely to loot the store, sending billions and billions and billions to Ukraine and Israel and, so forth, and clean energy initiatives, which are nothing of the sort. If the looting continues, at a certain point, people will cease to regard the federal government as legitimate. And when they cease to regard the federal government as legitimate, they will very rapidly cease to regard it as overwhelmingly powerful because they will find out there's nothing they can do about that. So the real question is just how much of the threat of this kind of general strike has
Yeah.
to be applied before the political class reins it in and starts behaving themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's amazing what they've accomplished and gotten away with the spying, with the playing around with our comms and
Yeah,
controlling that, and
yeah,
they
yeah,
still have the MSNBC or the mainstream media. They still have the
yeah,
New York Times. They still have
yeah.
an aura of prestige. Harvard,
Yeah,
Yale, they're
and
all in bed with you.
boomers
And boomers.
watch CNN and read
Yeah.
newspapers.
Yeah.
But the boomers are not going to be around forever. They're getting
Yeah.
old.
Yeah. Well, see, this is the problem with that second hero of yours, the guy who wants to have people not die. Is like, what if it's just the eternal boomers?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Something I something I joke about is if Brian Johnson succeeds in 10 years, then the boomers will be in charge forever and the world will be a perpetual nightmare. And if he succeeds in 25, 30 years, then Gen X will be in charge forever and we will have utopia and we will inherit the stars.
Oh wow! What's the magic of Gen X? What? There's a
They hate
truth there,
they
but there's
hate
a
boomers.
okay, but
They hate the nonsense.
okay,
Gen X was raised by the boomers, and so consequently, there's no one who resents the boomers and their bullshit more than Gen
yeah.
X.
But what is the boomer bullshit, and why has it reigned supreme for so long?
Socialism, basically. This idea of collective top-down policy to create a utopian society.
Okay,
Opposition to capitalism, opposition to the free market,
but the boomers boomed
opposition
because
to,
of those things.
well, yes, of course. And they assumed that they succeeded on their own talent.
Hmm.
They assumed that what was special was not capitalism, but them. So, having succeeded because of capitalism, having become wealthy because of capitalism, they then turned around and voted against it.
Hmm.
Both Democrats and Republicans. This is
Hmm.
not a partisan thing. You know, Republicans are the party of 3% less socialism.
Okay. And how does one reverse that? I guess like you're saying, just divest trust
Yes,
and
divest trust, divest cooperation.
yeah, and just do it old. But what about the strategy that the Democrats explicitly have been very successful with regard to like intersectional politics, with regards to stirring up grievance,
Hmm.
stirring up racial animosity, gender animosity?
Hmm.
What about
Oh,
that
sure.
strategy to fracture people? How do you perceive people overcoming that or seeing through it or
Well, that's
moving
going
past
to
it?
be an interesting question. It's a lot of it is when do some of these sort of racial and demographic special interest groups notice that they are the useful idiots of the left?
Yeah.
You know, notice that, black people keep voting Democrat
And
or
Democrats are
and and
pouring
and
immigrants into the country,
things
which are
don't
hitting
get
blacks
yeah, things don't get any better
in the
for them.
pocketbook. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, it's sort of a uniparty at this point, so it's not it's not clear that things would get any better for some of these groups if they were to vote Republican. But they, what's happening now is that they are giving their votes in exchange for nothing. They are saying, they are being told, oh, see that guy over there? He's racist. And then they will give you their vote for free, as opposed to them saying, so what? What are you going to give me?
Yeah.
What are you going to give me if I vote for you?
Yeah.
And so the divide and conquer has worked very well for the past, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 decades, whatever. But the divide and conquer was really predicated on technology, because technology is the arrow of history.
Hmm.
Technology is the terrain of history. It's what creates lasting change. We talked about that earlier.
Hmm.
And the technologies of the 20th century, the communications technologies of the 20th century, were radio and television. Radio and television are centralized. They are one-to-many communications mediums. So to control the narrative, all you have to do is control a few people. So now we have the internet. And that is a many-to-many communications technology. So this divide and conquer strategy is less adapted to that. These narratives are starting to fall apart. And you're seeing a backlash from the political class. You're seeing a crackdown. And that can be very disheartening. But you want to keep in mind that these are moves made out of desperation.
Hmm.
You know, the narrative was always controlled in the 80s and 90s. It was just that nobody noticed it because it was happening through television. Now people are questioning the official story. People are turning to alternative sources of news, or realize that most of the news is simply things that doesn't affect them and they don't really need to know.
Hmm.
So it's a lot harder to to control a society through deception in the age of the internet than it is in the age of radio and television. And I think that trend only intensifies in the future.
Hmm. Do you perceive the need for a strong actor or a strong man to make some of these breaks? And do you see anybody in our political class
It
that's capable of
helps.
doing that?
It helps.
Yeah.
Yeah, Elon Musk buying Twitter certainly helped,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know. But I think that crystals will form around grains of dust when a medium becomes saturated. So it's not all about the great man. It's not all about one specific great man. It's about when there is a demand for a certain type of discourse or a certain type of action,
Hmm.
it creates the conditions that empower the people who are willing to do that. And, I've noticed that myself because, like I said before, I am a highly disagreeable person who is much more interested in calling out nonsense than in not offending people.
Hmm.
You know, 10 years ago, that would have gone nowhere. I would have been called racist
Crank.
and
Yeah.
misogynist and, istophobe and whatever. And people would have been afraid to listen to or associate with me or allow me to speak. But now, I get the occasional weirdo, calling me a Nazi from
Hmm.
his mom's basement. And
Yeah.
I'm just like, "Hmm, okay, whatever.
Hmm.
I'm going to say what I've got to say, and nobody's listening to you. They're listening to me
Yeah.
because I'm telling them things that that speak to and make sense of the frustrations they're experiencing.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of louder voices with larger followings who are saying not precisely the same thing, but kind of in the same vein.
Hmm.
So I think that the people who controlled the narrative before are starting to feel their grasp slip, and they're panicking.
Hmm. Do you
And
think
they're
they'll change
trying
their
to,
tune?
well, they're trying right now to use the tools they have, which is things like control of the currency and the law. But the more they use these tools and the more they make people uncomfortable with these tools, the less compliance they will have with their control of these tools, and the less useful these tools will become.
Yeah.
So it really all depends on whether the sort of the crime families of politics, the Obamas and so forth, are going to see this and pull back, or whether they're going to sort of double down
Hmm.
and just try to brazen it out. It's
Yeah.
going to be interesting to watch.
You
Make
think
sure
it's
you're well supplied with popcorn
oh yeah, okay, popcorn
and
and ammo.
ammunition.
Yeah, that's both things that go ping pang,
Yes.
ping pong.
Yeah.
Do you see this as imminent or 20 years, 50 years? Like you think this
Impossible to say.
yeah, okay.
Impossible to say. I think that people are upset enough that there's a large motivation for change, but that can go very badly or it can go very well.
Hmm.
The collapse of the Soviet Union, for example, was extremely peaceful and extremely pro-social because things had just reached a point where somebody turned to somebody else and said, this kind of sucks. Let's not be communist anymore. And everybody just kind of went, yeah. I mean, there were a few holdouts, and there was even a very small amount of violence, I'm given to understand, but it was minuscule.
Hmm.
And so, you can have that, or you can have Cambodia, or you can have a Rwandan machete party.
Hmm.
And it's really, really, really impossible to predict which of those things will happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you get a lot of pundits of sort of the Alex Jones stamp
Hmm.
who will pound the table and predict what's going to happen based on whatever it plays with their audience.
Hmm.
But I try to confine myself to describing the board and the pieces. I
Yeah.
can't predict the game.
Yeah. Can you predict what you'll be doing over the course of this next few months, over the course of the summer? Do you have things planned out? Do you have threads in the making? Do you have a theme
Oh,
that's
yes.
emerging in your nonfiction and
In
as
my
well your fiction?
nonfiction, oh well,
Yeah,
my nonfiction, I just hammer out whatever pops into my crazed head.
yeah, 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 and roll with it.
And quite frequently I'm reacting to the latest piece of nonsense.
Yeah,
So it's
yeah.
just this kind of running commentary that helps people make sense of the world. The
Yeah.
fiction is very planned out.
Okay.
I'm about 55,000 words into the sequel, and that's actually going very well. And I
Hmm.
hope to be out in quarter 4 of this year, possibly slipping to early next year, but we'll see.
Hmm.
And, in the summer, I get to find out whether I actually win the Prometheus Award
Hmm. Okay.
because I was selected as one of the 5 finalists.
Wow.
for the
Congrats.
Prometheus Award for Best Novel. And being selected as a finalist is actually very exciting for me
Hmm.
because even if I don't win, for the rest of my life, I get to say that I beat Salman Rushdie in a writing contest.
Yeah.
Sorry, Salman. No malice.
Yeah.
You have many, many times the reputation I do, but allow me this one small
Well,
victory.
he's got much more entrenched haters, albeit you're trying to get some really good haters, but his
Well,
haters are a
the
little
the
bit more.
Prometheus Awards are given by the Libertarian Futurist Society, so I
Really?
don't really think he has too many haters among them.
Okay.
But
Yeah. Hmm.
we'll see if I win. I'm up against some stiff competition.
Oh,
I'm
wonderful.
also I'm also getting the audiobook out
Oh, cool.
and for Theft of Fire, and that is very exciting because I found some extremely talented actors.
Oh, wonderful.
And at first I was like, oh, I guess I should do an audiobook. And then I auditioned people and I found some voices that I was like, oh,
Oh,
we can
fun.
make something special.
Oh, cool.
Very
Wow.
exciting.
And when do you expect that to be released?
Released. It's gonna take a little while, so
Okay.
maybe
Yeah.
summer.
Yeah.
He's talking about the audiobook, yeah.
If you go to Devon's website, you can sign up for the mailing list for the Kickstarter for the
Yes.
audiobook.
Yes, the Kickstarter is imminent.
Yeah.
And then it will probably take us a few months to actually produce the audiobook, and then we
Yeah.
have distribution channels to work with and so forth.
It
So
will
Yeah.
be available on Audible. They have terrible
yes,
terms
yes.
for
Audible
authors.
thinks that authors shouldn't be paid, but that's another story. This is
Yeah.
this is my agent. She's
Yeah.
tirelessly hounding me to do things like hold the book up on camera
Yeah.
and and constantly say the name. And I tell her that I am not a human golden retriever. I do not cheer about things. That is your job.
Yeah. Huh.
But
Where can people find your work?
well, to follow my daily thoughts, Twitter is where I spew most of my madness, but I also have a website, devoneriksen.com, and Theft of Fire is available wherever books are sold.
Hmm.
Almost wherever books are sold, although in a lot of bookstores you have to order it.
Yeah.
But we were determined that we were going to launch very broadly.
Okay.
So we're not just on Amazon, we're on many, many platforms.
Oh, great. And I will link all of that in the description so that people can easily access your fabulous work and your range of work. And also, if so inclined, they can sign up for the mailing list that will link to the Kickstarter
Yes,
when that Kickstarter for the
yes,
audiobook
yes. Of course,
is
I'll be
available.
shouting about the Kickstarter on Twitter as well.
Yeah. Cool.
So,
What's
anyone
one
who
of
can
the
hear my voice in any capacity will hear all about that.
what's one of your tweets that had evoked a particularly entertaining reaction for you, or what was the topic?
I think one of the ones that first made me go viral was Emmett Shear, who was one of the founders of Twitch and briefly the CEO of OpenAI, came out with this absolutely insane proposition that we should have a 100% inheritance tax, which I later walked it back to 50%. And I pointed out some of the problems with this idea and the fact that this was basically implementing Marxism. This is basically one step to a communist society.
Hmm.
And, that was what gained me like 19,000 followers overnight and put me on the map. But I think the reason that resonated was that a lot of people are sort of afraid. They're made afraid when prominent figures say things like that because they realize that the leaders of their society, the wealthy, the elites, the powerful, the people who senators will take their phone calls, are just really, really profoundly unserious people.
Hmm.
and they just sort of say stuff and plan stuff on a whim because they think they're smarter than everybody else. And so, maybe they're smart, but they treat this like a problem on a worksheet. I'm going to devote 15 seconds of thought to this,
Hmm.
and I'm not going to test my ideas. I'm just going to, start advocating for them in the political process. And I think people were very relieved to start hearing people talk about, you know, this is nonsense. You are not elites. You are not smarter. You don't know any better. You just have more money.
Hmm.
And this is not how we run a society. We don't run a society through the political process. We are a free society. We are a capitalist society. People are supposed to be free to try their own ideas. So I think that was the first, that was the first one. And then I kind of continued in this vein of pushing against bad ideas and
Hmm.
just, trying to express what other people feel. I think the role of a philosopher, is not any great sort of grand, mind-blowing new idea that you come up with. It's just that you articulate what the people around you are thinking in an understandable way. You don't read philosophy and say, "Oh, I never thought of that." You read philosophy and you say, "Oh, yeah, I've felt like that for quite some time. This is what I've been thinking all along." So I feel like maybe that's my role, is to try to help articulate what a lot of people feel in a way that makes sense for them and allows them to say, "Yes, I agree with this.
Hmm.
Me too."
Well, yeah, that's a very good goal and very realizable with your particular set of skills.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah. Well, Devon, thank you very much for joining me this afternoon. Thank your wife as
Yeah,
well for
yeah,
hooking us up, and
yeah.
tell her cheers for
Well,
me.
thank you
Uh,
for patiently listening to my rants.
no,
So it's been great fun.
it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure.